Welcome to the Military Aviation Preservation Society American History Program. In this presentation, we're going to ask you to approach your understanding of history from a different viewpoint. Every account of history is from a human perspective. Even history textbooks, which are trying to be objective, show us what the writer values by what they include, what they leave out, and how they frame their historical accounts. Exploring multiple perspectives requires incorporating source materials that reflect different views of a historical event. Taking a historical perspective means understanding the social, cultural, intellectual, and emotional settings that shaped people's lives and actions in the past. A quote commonly misattributed to Winston Churchill, "History is written by the victors," still holds true even today. If history is written by the victor, how much do we really know about history? A second quote, however, should be the foundation of why we study history. The statement was written by an American philosopher by the name of George Santayana in 1905. In his work, The Life of Reason, he wrote, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." That statement alone should highlight not only the need to study and to understand history, but to apply the lessons that have been passed on to us. What we are going to ask you to do in this program is to question history, to discuss not only what, when, and where a historical event occurred, but ask why it happened. We're going to ask you to think, to discuss, to reason, and to come to your own conclusions about history. Why did our forefathers condone slavery? How could sane, rational people plunge the world into the war to end all wars in 1914? When you can question history, you can truly understand it. History is more than dates and places. It is people just like us. Why must we study history? We study history not to memorize facts and figures, dates and places. We study history so that we do not make the same mistakes as those that came before us. This segment of our program was designed to support high school classroom instruction dealing with American History Content Statement Number 3. This is perhaps the most difficult of all standards to teach, as it requires you to think of history not in terms of isolated events in the chronological march of time. You must now bring together all the historical strands that lead up to an event and examine the event from multiple perspectives in order to understand why the event occurred. Most studies in history typically present only a single perspective, that of the author. That viewpoint mirrors the perspective that many take on life in general, a perspective that is still the root cause of many current world issues. It is built into how we define right and wrong. If you are truly honest with yourself, you would realize that we all have had to address the concept at some point in our lives. Have you ever had the following thoughts? If I am right, then you must be wrong. If what I believe is good, then what you believe must be evil. If the group or team I belong to, the school that I go to, or the community or country that I live in represents the good guys, then those outside of my group of friends, the opposing team, and anyone outside my community or my country must be the bad guys. But how do the people in the other group, the opposing team, or the other country feel about you? What would happen to our perceptions of history if we reversed the roles and looked at history from the other side? From that perspective, when we look at how wars are started, we can look at it as a chess game, where normally logical, rational people start making decisions that they believe are in the best interest of their countries or their people, and resisting any acts by others that might harm their country or their people. As the game progresses, the options are reduced until one player has no other choice but war, the checkmate move. Unlike chess, however, in war, the game is not over. In war, there are no prescribed moves, no rules, and very truthfully, no winners. One of the things that you will learn both in the study of history and in real life is that there is more than one side to a story, more than one perspective. When planning a military operation, you plan what you want to accomplish, but at some point you turn the tables to see what the other side can do. It is the same with chess. Before you make a move, you examine what your opponent can or will do because of that move. We're going to look at cause and effect in a historical event that you are familiar with. The attack on the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. However, in this presentation, we're going to look at the events leading up to the date that will live in infamy, from both the U.S. perspective and that of the Japanese. On December 8, 1941, the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, made a short speech to a joint session of Congress. In the last paragraph of that speech, he used the word unprovoked to describe the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor the day before. Your perspective on the attack might depend on what side of the attack you were standing on. Ask most Americans how the United States got into World War II, and they will tell you that the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor and we fought back. Studies of history in this country highlight Japanese military atrocities, aggressiveness, and expansionism without any mention of actions by the colonial powers in the Pacific Basin. We tend to look at history from the perspective of our values, beliefs, and attitudes, which are all learned behaviors, failing to realize that other cultures may view the world through different standards, expectations, and norms. In this program, we'll be highlighting both perspectives, both viewpoints, and some things that are typically not found in general history studies. It is not an attempt to justify Japanese actions during the war, but more of an understanding that there is more than one viewpoint, and that there is more to history than we realize. As Paul Harvey, a longtime radio commentator, used to say, and now, the rest of the story. In the 1860s, Japanese national leadership systematically ended feudalism and transformed an isolated, underdeveloped island nation into a world power that closely followed Western models. Japan's Industrial Revolution began about 1870. The reason for this change was their belief that to achieve equality with the existing industrial nations, particularly the United States and Great Britain among others, that Japan had to compete with them, both industrially and militarily. That strength, in turn, would allow Japan to lead the region out from under the rule of European colonial powers. These countries controlled a majority of Southeast Asia and were using the region's natural resources to maintain their industrial supremacy. The Japanese government built railroads, improved roads, and inaugurated a land reform program to prepare the country for further development. Modern industry first appeared in textiles, including cotton and especially silk, which were based on home workshops in rural areas. The government inaugurated a new Western-based education system for all young people, sent thousands of students to the United States and Europe, and hired more than 3,000 Westerners to teach modern science, mathematics, technology, and foreign languages in Japan. Because Japan, as an island nation, has few natural resources, a majority of their growing industrial base had to rely on imported raw materials, such as coal, iron ore or scrap steel, tin, copper, bauxite, rubber, and petroleum. Without access to such imports, many of which came from the United States or from European colonies in Southeast Asia, Japan's industrial economy would have ground to a halt. This factor alone played a large part in what was to follow. Democracy was not possible at that time because Japan's powerful military was semi-independent and overruled or assassinated opponents, including one of their own prime ministers. The parliamentary government in Japan was not able to stand up under the economic and political pressures of the late 1920s and 1930s during the Depression period, and the Japanese state became increasingly militarized. At the same time, Japan also built a military-industrial complex to support an increasingly powerful army and navy. These armed forces allowed Japan to increase access to vital natural resources and sources of labor by projecting its power into various places in the Pacific and East Asia, including Korea and North China, although the conflicts between China and Japan could be traced back to the 1890s. This was now a challenge to the existing colonial powers in the Pacific area, including Great Britain, France, Russia, the Netherlands, and the United States. This stressed relationships between Japan and these nations, as they were now in economic competition for the same raw materials and the same markets. In 1935, 1936, and 1937, the United States Congress passed the Neutrality Acts to prohibit the U.S. from selling goods to countries at war. The acts were designed to isolate the U.S. from falling into another unpopular war like World War I. The President was reluctant to sign the acts because they prohibited the U.S. from helping allies in need. That put the President in a difficult position. He was caught between the powerful corporate interest that pushed for larger and larger shares of overseas markets and pressure to end foreign entanglements from isolationist elements across the country. Still, the acts were not active unless Roosevelt invoked them, which he did not do in the case of Japan and China. He favored China in the crisis, and by not invoking the 1936 Act, he could still provide economic and military aid to the Chinese. Due to the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, the United States government, beginning in 1938, adopted and put into effect a policy of informally discouraging the extension of credit by United States corporations and financial institutions to Japan. This war was the result of the decades-long Japanese imperialist policy to expand its influence politically and militarily in order to secure access to raw material reserves, food, and labor. In 1939, the United States terminated the 1911 commercial treaty with Japan. This treaty provided for equal free trade between the two countries. Its end removed any legal obstacles to an embargo by the United States upon shipment of materials to Japan. On May 7, 1940, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was ordered to move from San Pedro, California, and to be permanently based at Pearl Harbor. The move was undertaken under protest by Admiral James Richardson, Commander-in-Chief U.S. Fleet. He met with Roosevelt on October 8, 1940, and again on January 5, 1941, to argue against the move. Richardson presented the President with a list of logical reasons why the fleet should not be based at Pearl Harbor. Richardson and most Navy officials who opposed the move thought a fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor would be unnecessarily exposed to Japanese naval strength. Roosevelt, however, believed relocating the fleet to Hawaii would exert a restraining influence on Japan. On February 1, 1941, Richardson was relieved of his command without any explanation and replaced by Admiral Husband E. Kimmel. From the American perspective, the move of the fleet to the territory of Hawaii was politically justified to counter what our government felt was unwarranted Japanese aggression in the Pacific. From a Japanese perspective, however, the United States had moved its primary strike force, the U.S. Pacific Fleet, twice as close to mainland Japan. The Japanese military establishment had little choice but to re-examine their future in terms of that move. All of the major Japanese war plans were based on the assumption that the U.S. Pacific Fleet was based in San Diego, so existing war plans had to be updated based on this move. As the U.S. Pacific Fleet now represented the primary threat to Japanese economic goals, one of those plans was directed at Pearl Harbor. Starting in the summer and fall of 1940, the United States attempted to restrain Japanese aggression through a series of economic sanctions and embargoes designed to cripple Japanese industry, and by doing so, slow its military advances. On July 2, 1940, Roosevelt signed the Export Control Act, authorizing the President to either license or prohibit the export of essential defense materials. Under that act, licenses were refused for the export to Japan of aviation gasoline, certain ores, and most types of machine tools beginning in August of 1940. On July 31, 1940, exports of aviation motor fuels and lubricants, heavy melting iron, copper, and steel scrap were restricted. 93% of Japan's copper came from the United States. At the same time, the United States was providing a majority of the war supplies to China. In September of 1940, Japan invaded French Indochina in an effort to cut off all imports into China, including war supplies purchased from the U.S. On October 16, 1940, an embargo was placed on all exports of iron and steel scrap to destinations other than Britain and the nations of the Western Hemisphere, and closed the Panama Canal to Japan. 74% of Japan's imports of scrap metal came from the United States. Planning for the attack on Pearl Harbor started early in 1941 under the direction of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He realized that if war came, Japan's hope for victory was limited by time and oil. As Yamamoto had studied at Harvard University and served twice as a Japanese military attaché in Washington, he was familiar with American industry and American resolve. He gave voice to his reservations about the attack during a meeting with a member of the Japanese cabinet when he said, "In the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success." This turned out to be a prophetic statement, as a large portion of the Japanese Imperial fleet was destroyed at Midway 6 months later. Nevertheless, Yamamoto accepted the reality of impending war and planned for a quick victory by destroying the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor in a preventative strike, while simultaneously thrusting into the oil and rubber resource-rich areas of Southeast Asia, especially the Dutch East Indies, Borneo, and Malaya. On January 24, 1941, nearly a full year before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox signed a letter to Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson that was amazingly prophetic in its content. In that correspondence, Knox stated that, "If war eventuates with Japan, it is believed easily possible that hostilities would be initiated by a surprise attack upon the fleet or the naval base at Pearl Harbor." On January 26, 1941, the Peruvian ambassador to Japan, Dr. Ricardo Schreiber, paid an urgent call on the American ambassador to Japan, Joseph Grew. He told GRU that he had information that the Japanese were planning to attack Pearl Harbor. He stated that the Japanese would attack the United States in the Central Pacific with all of their might and aircraft. On January 27, 1941, more than 10 months before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, GRU secretly cabled the State Department with information that Japan was planning a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. In his message, GRU stated, "My Peruvian colleague told a member of my staff that he has heard from many sources, including a Japanese source, that the Japanese military force planned, in the event of trouble with the United States, to attempt a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor using all of their military facilities." GRU concluded his communication by stating, he added that, although the project seemed fantastic, the fact that he had heard it from many sources prompted him to pass on the information. On February 1, 1941, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Harold Stark, sent a message to Admiral Kimmel in Hawaii, passing on the information received from Japan. Stark concluded his message with the following, quote, "The Division of Naval Intelligence places no credence in these rumors. Furthermore, based on known data regarding the present disposition and employment of Japanese naval and army forces, no move against Pearl Harbor appears imminent or planned for the foreseeable future." Japan and the United States engaged in negotiations during the course of 1941 in an effort to improve relations. During these negotiations, Japan considered withdrawal from most of China and Indochina after drawing up peace terms with the Chinese. Japan would also adopt an independent interpretation of the tripartite pact between Germany, Japan, and Italy, and would not discriminate in trade provided all other countries reciprocated. However, the compromises in China were rejected by General Tojo, then War Minister. During the summer and fall of 1941, some 300 American men carrying civilian passports boarded ships destined for Burma. With unwritten approval from the United States government, these volunteers were discharged from the armed services to be employed for training and instruction by a private military contractor, the Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company. The first American volunteer group of the Chinese Air Force in 1941 and 1942, nicknamed the Flying Tigers, was composed of pilots of the United States Army Air Corps, Navy, and Marine Corps recruited under presidential authority. The members of the group had contracts with salaries roughly 3 times what they had been making in the U.S. forces. Since the U.S. was not at war, this special air unit could not be organized overtly, but the request was approved by President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself. The resulting clandestine operation was organized in large part by the White House. Financing was handled by the China Defense Supplies, with money loaned by the U.S. government. Purchases were then made by the Chinese under the cash and carry provision of the Neutrality Act of 1939. Some of the pilots were also orally promised a bounty of $500 for each enemy aircraft shot down, but no one knew if that would actually happen until they returned home and found the funds deposited in their banks. Responding to Japanese occupation of key airfields in Indochina on July 24th, following an agreement between Japan and Vichy France, the U.S. froze Japanese assets on July 26, 1941. On July 31, 1941, Foreign Minister Toyota sent a coded message to Ambassador Nomura in America, stating, "Commercial and economic relations between Japan and third countries, led by England and the United States, are gradually becoming so horribly strained that we cannot endure it much longer. Consequently, our empire, to save its very life, must take measures to secure the raw materials of the South Seas. The United States had broken the Japanese diplomatic code prior to this time, so knew well what was happening. On August 1st, 1941, the United States embargoed the export of coal, rubber, oil, and gasoline to Japan. Japan's most critical import. 80% of Japan's oil came from the United States. The British and Dutch followed suit, embargoing exports to Japan from their colonies in Southeast Asia. Japanese war planners had long looked south, especially to Brunei for oil, and to Malaya for rubber and tin. The Navy was certain that any attempt to seize this region would bring the U.S. into the war, but the complete Allied oil embargo removed any hesitancy. In their final proposal on November 20th, Japan offered to withdraw its forces from southern Indochina and not to launch any attacks in Southeast Asia, provided the U.S., Britain, and the Netherlands ceased aiding China and lifted their sanctions against Japan. On November 26, 1941, the State Department delivered its response to Japan. Sanctions would only be lifted if all overseas Japanese troops were withdrawn to Japan without condition. The American counterproposal of November 26th also required Japan to conclude non-aggression pacts with Pacific powers. It did not specifically exempt Manchuria, in which hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians were already living. Hideki Tojo, now Japanese Prime Minister, said, "This is an ultimatum," when he received the American counterproposal. Secretary of War Stimson confided to his personal diary after a meeting of the War Cabinet on November 25, 1941, 2 weeks before the attack, when he wrote, "The question was how we should maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves." This statement caused a good deal of controversy during the Congressional Joint Committee hearings on the investigation of the Pearl Harbor attack conducted between November of 1945 and May of 1946. Looking back, however, it appears to be more of an accurate assessment of the climate in America at that time. Due to the devastation and loss of life caused as a result of our first participation in international conflict in World War I, most Americans wanted a hands-off approach to any future wars. This was one of the primary reasons that the United States had refused to join the League of Nations at the end of the war. As a result of this widespread public sentiment, however, isolationist groups gained popularity and became a powerful political force. This presented a dilemma for those at the highest levels of government. In a free and open society such as the one that we enjoy, there are two things required to win a war: a trained and professional military force, and one that we too often ignore: public support. In the history of this nation, we have only lost public support once. The decision that American leadership had to make was a difficult one. Given the deep divides in the country, could the United States afford to fire the first shots of the war and risk the wrath of the isolationists? The other option, perhaps the most painful, was to let the other side fire the first shot and solidify public support for what was surely to follow. This second option, the one regretfully necessary, came at a high cost. After the attack, Stimson confessed that my first feeling was of relief, that a crisis had come in a way which would unite all our people. This continued to be my dominant feeling in spite of the news of catastrophes which quickly developed. For I feel that this country united has practically nothing to fear, while the apathy and division stirred by unpatriotic men have been hitherto very discouraging. After President Roosevelt ordered the Pacific Fleet to be forward-based, the fleet aircraft carriers and their aircraft squadrons trained intensively and transported aircraft among the island bases of the Pacific. On November 28, 1941, Task Force 8, built around the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise under the command of Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr., left Pearl Harbor to deliver the aircraft of Marine Fighter Squadron 211 to Wake Island. The Enterprise was scheduled to return to Pearl Harbor on December 6th, but was delayed by bad weather and the need to refuel her escorting destroyers. On December 1st, 1941, Major General Henry Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, directed the reinforcement of the Philippine Army Air Corps by sending 4 heavy bomber groups and 2 fighter squadrons to the Philippines. By the time hostilities broke out 6 days later, only 170 P-40 Tomahawk fighters and 35 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers were in place in the Philippines. The rest were en route, some arriving in Hawaii on the morning of December 7, 1941. On December 5, 1941, Task Force 12, commanded by Rear Admiral John H. Newton, centered around the aircraft carrier USS Lexington, sailed from Pearl to ferry the aircraft of Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 231 to Midway Island. When notified of the attack, the Lexington began searching for Japanese carriers. But since the Japanese Imperial Navy was so far north, the Lexington was out of range. The other U.S. carrier, the USS Saratoga, had just been refitted at Bremerton Navy Yard and was in San Diego to pick up the 4 squadrons that would make up its air wing, as well as ferry Marine Fighter Squadron 221 to Pearl Harbor. On December 8th, the ship, now the flagship of Carrier Division 1, commanded by Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, sailed for Pearl Harbor. The Japanese, however, saw these moves as a prelude to war. The United States was moving its military might to forward bases capable of striking Japanese interests throughout the Pacific. To the Japanese, checkmate had occurred. They felt that they had been placed into a position from which they had but one recourse. As a result, Japanese leadership came to 2 conclusions. 1. The United States did not want Japan emerging as a world economic power and competing for Asian markets. And 2. The United States wanted Japanese industries dependent upon U.S. imports, and that control of productivity and profitability would remain under the control of the West. These were conditions that a proud Japanese nation could not accept. The war that we study was a product of the moves and countermoves by both sides, so both sides share in the result. From the Japanese perspective, the original concept of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was an idealistic wish to free Asia from colonizing powers. But soon, nationalists saw it as a way to gain resources to keep Japan a modern power, and militarists saw the same resources as the raw materials for war. The U.S., on the other hand, recognizing the abundance of potential wealth in these markets, refused to let the Japanese have an advantage in selling to China. The ultimate result was the war we study in American history. In effect, the combination of Japanese militarism, coupled with the U.S. tactic of economic sanction, led these countries to war. In this case, we mistakenly attempted to use American standards to assess what Japan would do. In effect, we neglected the military axiom of know thy enemy. We ignored the fact that the Japanese code of death before dishonor would not allow them to accept the dishonor that was being forced upon them. If war was necessary to save face, then it was the honorable thing to do. Before you attempt to answer the question of was the attack on Pearl Harbor unprovoked, or any other historical question, you must look at the issue from all perspectives. Look at history not from a one-sided study of events, but rather put together all of the pieces, all the events leading up to a single point in time from all perspectives, and understand that differing values, beliefs, and attitudes will shape others' viewpoints and ultimately their actions.